In the last section, we finished setting up a new action creator called fetchWeather that's going to be responsible for creating an action that contains a request to the backend API. Its type was fetchWeather. Also note that the fetchWeather action creator takes a city, which is a string, and uses it as part of the search query, like so. We also installed the Axios library, which essentially behaves exactly like the jQuery's AJAX method. It just reaches out, does an AJAX request in the form of a GET to the URL that we supply, and it returns a promise. We pass that promise in to the actions payload property here. Okay, let's go ahead and move back to the search bar. The goal here is to call the action creator whenever the user submits the form. And as we previously discussed, we kind of took care of that already here with the onSubmit form event. What we want to do is wire up this form submit so that whenever a user types something in and then presses enter or clicks the search button, we fire that action creator and make our actual API request. So remember, we're working in a container here, and the container needs to be able to call an action creator. It needs to be able to reach out to Redux and work with Redux directly. That means that we need to connect our search bar container to Redux using the connect method from the React Redux library. We're also going to bind the action creator fetchWeather as a property to this container, as we've done previously. I know that going through the container setup process here probably ends up being a little bit confusing, but again, this is something where just a repeated process, it's nearly always completely identical. So let's go ahead and walk through it step by step. At the top, we're going to import a couple things up here that we've already imported in other components before. We'll get the connect method from React Redux. We'll get bind action creators from Redux, and then we'll get the action creator that we just created. So we'll import fetchWeather from, go up into actions, and then index. So up into actions, and then index. Okay. Now before we go any farther, I would really like it if you save this directory or save this file right here and go back over to the browser and just refresh the page. And basically all I want to make sure that happens here is that you don't get any errors popping up here in the console. So open up your console, double check it, make sure that no errors are popping up. We just added a bunch of code in the action creator over here with a lot of kind of complicated syntax in here, and I just want to make sure that you don't have any typos in there before we go any further. Okay, since that looks like it's working just fine, let's get back to it. So our goal here is to hook up the action creator fetchWeather to our search bar container. So remember, we do that by defining a function at the bottom called map dispatch to props. And then inside of here, we will return a call to bind action creators with fetchWeather. And then as a separate set of parentheses, we'll pass in, typo here. As a second argument, we pass in dispatch, like so. So remember, this causes the action creator, whenever it gets called and returns an action, bind action creators with dispatch, make sure that that action flows down into the middleware and then the reducers inside of our Redux application. So we've got our map dispatch to props. Now we'll just export default and connect null, bear with me a second here, map dispatch to props with search bar. And before we talk about that null, just one more thing up here on the class, let's make sure that we aren't exporting that as the default anymore. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're down here at connect with null as the first argument. So I don't think we've seen this before. Previously, we've had components or containers where we map dispatch to props and we map state to props as well. So the only reason that we're passing null in here is that whenever we are passing in a function that is supposed to map our dispatch to the props of our container, it always goes in as the second argument in here. That's all. That's the only reason that we pass null in for the first one. By passing in null for the first argument here, all we're saying is, hey, I understand that Redux is maintaining some state, but this container just doesn't care about it all. Thanks, but we don't need any state here. Okay, so by binding the action creator fetch weather to dispatch and then mapping it to props, that gives us access to the function this.props.fetchWeather inside of our component here. So let's go ahead and call that action creator now. Inside of our onFormSubmit, which is when we want to call that action creator, because that means like, hey, the user's trying to search for a given city, we'll say this.props.fetchWeather. And then we need to pass in the actual city, the actual search term, which is, as we've set up previously, this.state.term. As a convenience to our users, after we kick off the search here, we'll also clear out that search input. We can clear the search input real easily by just calling this.setState and set term to empty string, like so. So whenever the user clicks submit or they press enter, with the form selected, it'll call our action creator with the search term that they entered, and then we will set the state of term to empty string, which will cause our component to re-render. The input has a value of this.state.term, so the input's value will now be empty string, so it will appear to have emptied out to the user. Okay, let's go ahead and give this a shot in the browser now. I'm going to save this and refresh. And then over in my console, I'm going to swap to the network tab. Then I'm going to go ahead and search for a city. Let's do New York. Oh, it looks like we've got a small error in here. Cannot read props of null. Aha! You might guess what's going on here. So we have onFormSubmit, which is a callback, and we just added in a reference to this, and our error message specifically was cannot read property props of null. Does that sound familiar at all? Does it sound like we might have forgotten a step somewhere in here? I hope it does. So remember, when we have a callback that we pass to a JSX element or to a DOM element here, and it makes a reference to this, we need to bind the context. So at the top in the constructor, we'll add this.onFormSubmit equals this.onFormSubmit.bind this. All right, so let's give this another shot. I'm going to refresh, and again, I'm going to search for New York, and then submit. Now you'll notice that, first off, the input cleared out, right, which is what we expected. When a user searches for something, we wanted the input to clear out immediately. We don't want them to have to, select the input again and, highlight all the content and delete it and what have you. The second thing you'll notice, over here on the right, it looks like our request was successfully completed. We've got the forecast endpoint with a status of 200. Let me go ahead and dial this up a little bit. There we go. Okay, I'm going to increase the size here, and I'm going to click on the request and make sure that I select the preview tab here. And you'll notice that we've got our response here, and it looks just like the response that we were looking at from the browser earlier on, if you recall looking at the JSON over here. I'm going to flip back over. There we go. So we've got our city property, which has the longitude, latitude. We've got the name of the city, and then we've got our big long list of all the different weather snapshots, one for every 3 hours for the next 5 days. And then each of these has their own, temperature and pressure and humidity. Exactly what we need. Great. This is looking pretty good. Okay, so we're definitely on track here. We're making a request to the correct endpoint, but you'll notice that we're still not making any use of the package that we installed earlier, Redux Promise. In addition, while we're successfully creating the AJAX request here, we're not really doing anything with it, right? We assign it to the payload here, but we're not actually making use of it at all. So let's go ahead and continue in the next section and get a better handle on what's going on here.